July 20, 1944, 9 p.m. Point 67, a low rise of wheat and hedgerow 8 kilometers south of Caen, France. The rain started before the tanks did. A hard, sideways Normandy downpour that turned the freshly dug slit trenches on the hill into standing water within the hour, and 30 minutes after that, out of the dark and the mud, came the first German counterattack. Within the next 48 hours, a single Canadian infantry company, fewer than 150 men, would be asked to hold this scrap of high ground against elements of 2 SS Panzer Divisions and a Wehrmacht infantry division sent specifically to take it back. For this isn't a story that ends with a clean victory. It's messier and, honestly, more interesting than that. It's a story about what holding a position actually costs when the enemy has decided you cannot be allowed to keep it. Let's be precise about who was where, because getting this right is the whole point of doing history properly. The men on Point 67 that night belonged to C Company of the Calgary Highlanders, part of the 5th Canadian Infantry Brigade, 2nd Canadian Infantry Division. They had taken the hill that same afternoon, July 20th, 1944, as part of Operation Atlantic, the Canadian half of a larger British offensive called Operation Goodwood, aimed at breaking the German grip on the high ground south of Caen. On paper, Point 67 doesn't look like much. A gentle, unremarkable rise you could walk across in 15 minutes. In practice, it was the single most important piece of terrain on that stretch of the Normandy front, because whoever held it could see and shell everything moving on the roads below for kilometers in every direction. Allied intelligence had told the Canadian command that the ridge was defended by the 272nd Infantry Division, a unit rated low category, freshly arrived from southern France, filled out with conscripted troops, not considered a serious threat. That assessment was about to be proven badly, dangerously wrong. Before I go further, I want to pause on something. This channel exists to dig up the real paper trail behind stories like this one, not the recycled, half-true version that gets passed around online. If that's what brought you here, drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from and whether anyone in your family served in it. Some of the best sourcing for videos like this one has come directly from families of the men involved, so I mean that seriously. Fightin'. Now, back to that hill in the rain after dark. 30 minutes after the Calgary Highlanders had started digging in, the Germans hit C Company's position with a violence that had nothing low category about it. Mixed into the assault were troops from the 272nd Infantry Division, yes, but reinforcing them was a battle group from the 1st SS Panzer Division, Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler, one of the most experienced armored formations in the entire Wehrmacht, pulled from reserve specifically to retake this ground. German armored doctrine at the time called for exactly this response. Let an outpost fall, thou shell it immediately, then counterattack before the new occupants can dig in properly. Point 67 was about to get the textbook version of that doctrine delivered in person. Fight. Lieutenant Vern Kilpatrick had taken a fighting patrol roughly 400 yards beyond the hill's forward edge when German tanks rolled directly over his position in the dark. He was hit by enemy fire. His men were not equipped with anything that should have been able to stop a tank at close range. They carried PIAT anti-tank launchers, spring-loaded weapons with an effective range measured in dozens of yards, not hundreds. What Kilpatrick's patrol did with them that night became one of the specific, verifiable details that separates this story from a vague legend. They immobilized 2 German tanks and knocked the turret clean off a third, using weapons the German crews likely assumed couldn't touch them at that range. That first clash was the warning shot. It told the rest of the battalion, dug into the mud on the crest above, for exactly what was coming for them next. And it told them they had perhaps minutes, not hours, to get underground before it arrived. Somewhere further back in the German rear areas that same night, from a 2nd SS Panzer Division, the 9th SS Hohenstaufen, was being positioned for what would become an even larger effort to break this position over the following 2 days. A single reinforced Canadian company was about to spend the next 48 hours standing between 2 of the most battle-hardened SS Panzer Divisions in Western Europe and the ground they needed back, July 20 to 21, 1944. Point 67, through the night and into the following dawn, Once Lieutenant Kilpatrick's patrol had blunted the first wave of tanks, the real weight of the counterattack came down on C Company's forward trenches. The same company that had led the climb up the hill that afternoon, and was now, roughly 6 hours later, absorbing the opening blow of a coordinated German effort to take it back. German defensive doctrine at this stage of the war followed a deliberate, well-rehearsed pattern, refined over years on multiple fronts. Let the enemy take a piece of ground, saturate it immediately with artillery and mortar fire, once you know exactly where they're dug in. Then throw armor and infantry back at it before the new occupants can properly consolidate. It was improvisation. It was standard procedure, and Point 67 was about to receive a textbook demonstration of it. The mortaring was constant, and by every surviving account, brutally accurate. Accurate enough that Calgary Highlanders Battalion Headquarters made the deliberate decision to shut off its own radio at one point. Convinced the Germans might somehow be using the signal to fine-tune their fire. At headquarters itself, an ammunition truck took a direct hit and went up in a blast large enough that it destroyed, among other things, the battalion pipe major's bagpipes, a small, almost absurd detail, but the kind of specific, verifiable fact that separates a real historical account from a dramatized one. This wasn't distant shelling. It was fire landing inside the command post, despite the intensity of the barrage and the armor pressing against their line. The German infantry available that night wasn't sufficient in numbers to actually overrun the position. The tanks could pin the Highlanders down and grind at their nerves, but without enough infantry to follow through and clear the trenches hand to hand, the hill did not change hands. B and D companies moved up to reinforce C Company's badly stretched line, and the battalion held through the worst of it as one unit rather than one exposed company. The cost, when the numbers were finally counted, tells you plainly what that night actually was. 6 officers and men were killed or went missing in the fighting. Kilpatrick among them, 22 years old, dead within hours of knocking a turret off a German tank with a weapon that was never really designed to fight tanks at all. 92 more were wounded, the overwhelming majority of them from C Company, the unit that had been sitting on the exposed forward slope when the counterattack hit, for a single infantry company that likely numbered somewhere around 100 to 120 men going into that night. Casualties in that range meant the company that greeted the dawn of July 21 was a fraction of the one that had climbed the hill the previous afternoon. And this is where the story needs to stay honest rather than reach for a cleaner ending than the record supports. The Germans did not commit 2 entire panzer divisions to retake Point 67 in one continuous assault. What the record actually shows is a battle group, not the full strength, of the 1st SS Panzer Division Leibstandarte, reinforcing troops of the 272nd Infantry Division on the ground that night, while the 9th SS Panzer Division Hohenstaufen was positioned in reserve in the same sector, ready to be committed as the wider fight for the whole Verrières Ridge continued to develop over the following days. That is a meaningfully different picture than 2 divisions attacking one hill at once, but it is, if anything, a more interesting one. It means a company-strength Canadian position had become important enough, in German operational thinking, that 2 of the most experienced SS Panzer formations in the West were being staged and fed into the effort to take back a piece of ground most maps wouldn't even bother to name. By the afternoon of July 21, the rest of 5th Canadian Infantry Brigade had moved up to reinforce the position the Highlanders had bought with the previous night's casualties, and Point 67 stayed in Canadian hands, a foothold that would matter enormously in the days that followed, because it became the jumping-off point for the far larger, far costlier Canadian attacks on the main Verrières Ridge that were still to come, including the disaster that would befall the Black Watch of Canada 5 days later. On July 25, when 325 men went forward and only 15 answered evening roll call. Point 67 wasn't the bloodiest chapter of that campaign. It was the one that made the bloodier chapters possible. The ground that had to be held first by a company of men from Calgary, in the mud, in the dark, against tanks their weapons weren't built to stop. July 25, 1944. 5 days after Point 67. The main Verrières Ridge, a few hundred meters south of the ground the Calgary Highlanders had bled to hold. This is the part of the story most documentaries skip past, and it's the part that actually explains why Point 67 mattered. On July 25, as part of Operation Spring, the Black Watch of Canada, the Royal Highland Regiment, was ordered forward across open ground toward Verrières Ridge itself, into the teeth of the same German defensive network the Calgary Highlanders had already tasted 5 nights earlier. Of the roughly 325 men of the Black Watch who crossed the start line that morning, only 15 answered evening roll call. It remains to this day one of the costliest single actions for a Canadian battalion in the entire war, Dieppe included. I'm telling you this not to end on a triumphant note, but because it's true, and because it puts what happened at Point 67 into its actual context, not as a standalone underdog victory, but as one bloody, necessary piece of a much larger and far more painful campaign. So what did holding Point 67 actually buy? 2 things, and both are documented, not speculative. First, the ground itself. Point 67 became the forward base from which the rest of 5th Canadian Infantry Brigade, and later the entire 2nd Canadian Infantry Division, staged the operations that followed against the main Verrières Ridge through the final week of July. Without that foothold secured on the night of July 20-21 for the launching point for everything that came after, including the costly July 25 attacks, would have had to start from further back, under direct German observation, the whole way. The 2nd Canadian Infantry Division's own casualty return for just those 2 days, July 20 and 21, stood at 1,349 killed, wounded, and missing. That is, the honest price of the ground the Highlanders' single company had opened the door to. Second, and this is the part that historians of the Normandy campaign keep returning to. The fighting at Verrières Ridge, brutal and frustrating as it was for the Canadians on the ground, was tying down exactly the German armour that mattered most, at exactly the moment it mattered most. The 1st SS, 9th SS, and 12th SS Panzer Divisions were all committed, in whole or in part, for holding this ridge south of Caen through the final 2 weeks of July 1944. Every tank and every battalion of experienced SS infantry pinned here, fighting for a hill most people have never heard of, was a tank and a battalion that was not available 300 kilometers to the west, where American forces under General Omar Bradley were quietly massing for Operation Cobra. The breakout attack launched on July 25, the very same day the Black Watch was being cut down at Verrières. Canadian and British official historians have argued for decades, with real evidentiary support, that the grinding, but costly fighting around Caen and Verrières Ridge was never really about taking Caen itself. It was about holding German armour in place long enough for the Americans to break out somewhere else. If that argument is correct, and the concentration of SS Panzer Divisions in this sector strongly supports it, then the men on Point 67 weren't just holding a hill. They were part of the reason the German army couldn't move its best tanks to stop Cobra when it mattered most. None of that erases the cost. Lieutenant Vern Kilpatrick was 22 when he died in the dark near Point 67 on July 20, 1944. 92 of his fellow Highlanders were wounded holding ground. Most of them had occupied for less than a full day. The Calgary Highlanders went on to fight through the rest of the Normandy campaign, the shelled estuary, and into the Netherlands and Germany before the war ended. More than 400 of them killed in action by May 1945, out of a regiment that, like most Canadian infantry battalions, rotated through several times its original strength in replacements over the course of the war. What happened on Point 67 on the night of July 20, 1944, doesn't get its own war memorial the way Juno Beach does, or its own feature film the way Dieppe or Normandy sometimes do. It's the kind of story that survives mostly in regimental histories, unit war diaries, and the memories families passed down, which is exactly why it matters that it gets told accurately, rather than exaggerated into something cleaner and simpler than what it actually was. So if this is the kind of history you want more of, the real numbers, the real units, the real cost, without the embellishment, let me know. Drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from, and whether anyone in your family served in it. If someone in your family wore that Calgary Highlanders badge, or fought anywhere in Normandy that summer, I'd genuinely like to hear it.